Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Milday, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at Western. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's Duncanson lecture featuring Dr. Jillian Horton. This year's lecture is a grand collaboration between a number of institutional partners, including the Grand Rounds and Peers for Peers programs at the Schulich School of Medicine, the Department of English and Writing Studies, the Words Festival, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. I want you to know that these partners work together on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. And this land is connected to several treaties that form an integral part of the history of this territory. It's a history that we don't always fully understand, or understand only from our own limited point of view. The university, as a place of higher learning, has a special responsibility to confront and address this history and continue the work of reconciliation that is required. The Duncanson Lecture Series is made possible by a generous gift from Tim Duncanson and is named in honor of Robert Duncanson and Marjorie Patricia Duncanson. The lecture series is intended to highlight the ways in which an arts and humanities lens illuminates some of the biggest challenges facing human society and helps to highlight solutions. Today's speaker is truly an exemplary living instance of this proposition. Dr. Jillian Horton is a general internist, a writer, and a musician. She's a former associate dean, associate chair of the Department of Internal Medicine, and director of the Allen Class Health Humanities Program at the Max Rady College of Medicine in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where she has won numerous awards for undergraduate teaching and mentorship. In her writing for the Canadian Medical Association Journal, Dr. Horton explores the emotions, unanswered questions, and complexities of the human side of medicine. In the Dear Dr. Horton column, she answers anonymous questions from readers. On the MedLife with Dr. Horton podcast, she interviews a wide range of experts with a view to deepening the national conversation about physician health. She has recently completed a book about mindfulness, burnout, and how experiences growing up with a profoundly disabled sibling shaped her view of what it means to be a doctor. This brilliant trajectory has a direct connection to the Faculty of Arts and Humanities because Dr. Horton has both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in English language and literature from Western. It is a great pleasure to welcome you back to Western. Now, let me say a few words about how today's event is going to unfold. First, I will shortly hand over the screen to Dr. Horton, who will present her talk on her book, We Are All Perfectly Fine. She will then be joined on screen by Dr. Andrea Lum and Dr. Laura Foxcroft from the Schulich School of Medicine, who will moderate a question and answer period. Dr. Lum is the Vice Dean, Faculty Affairs, and Dr. Foxcroft is the Assistant Dean, Faculty Wellbeing. Both of them participate in Schulich's innovative Peers for Peers program, which supports clinical faculty through one-on-one mentoring. Finally, I would like to acknowledge and thank a number of people who made today's event possible, including Tim Duncanson, Dr. Faisal Rehman and Laurie Cameron from the Department of Medicine, Shannon Artfeld from Obstetrics and Gynecology, Josh Lambier from the Words Festival, Melissa Parker from Arts and Humanities, and Professors Menina Jones and Mary Helen McMurrin from the Department of English and Writing Studies. And now it is my great pleasure to hand things over to Jillian Horton. Jillian, please.
So I want to start by saying a tremendous thank you to all of you. There are 4 partners and so many individuals, as Michael said, who made this talk possible today. And the Department of English, the Faculty of Arts, the School of Medicine and Dentistry, and WordFest. I'm just grateful to all of you for coming together and for inviting me to be here today. It is an absolute privilege. And one of the reasons that this event is so meaningful to me is that my relationship with Western really profoundly changed my life. And we may have an opportunity to talk about the few ways in which that transpired at the end of the lecture. But in particular, one person I want to acknowledge, because I know he is on the call all the way out in Newfoundland, is Professor Emeritus Stan Dragland. He has been my mentor for 25 years, more actually, and I really don't think I ever would have finished this book without him, which I think is a pretty incredible testament to the longevity and the commitment of the relationships that many teachers have with students at Western. I think that that is a pretty fundamental aspect of my story and success as well. So, as I was saying earlier, just before we got started, it is bittersweet for me not to be able to be there with you today. I really would have loved to be delivering a lecture in the same hall that used to be the drama workshop, my old haunt. But at the same time, I was thinking that there's sort of a literary quality to me not being able to be there. Protagonist's joyful return is disrupted by global pandemic. So maybe we'll work that into a future book or something. But this is often the very tension of good literature. And it is certainly the kind of tension that characterizes a life in medicine. But we have a very diverse audience today that is more than just medicine. And so, because of that, I am going to try to speak to you from both the head and also from the heart. And we often talk about them as if they are a dichotomy, just the way we create this false dichotomy of the arts and the sciences. But I'm going to talk about them today as if they exist on a continuum because I absolutely believe that they do. So, for doctors, some of our biggest milestones aren't graduations, but they are exams. And that's where I would like to begin our journey today, talking about that particular physician ritual. So, for those of us who are physicians, we know that the oral exam, and particularly the fellowship examinations for those who are specialists, have a mythical significance in the journey of our personal lives. And so the setup of the exam is you go into a room as a candidate at the end of your fellowship training, and you're greeted there by two examiners, and they say, "Hello, Dr. Horton," and you say, "Hello, examiners." And then you sit down and they say to you something like, "You, Dr. Horton, are a specialist on call at a small community hospital, and you are asked to see a 40-year-old man with chest pain and shortness of breath. Could you please tell us your approach to this problem?" And that's how this exam proceeds. And one of the idiosyncrasies of this examination, probably like many postgraduate examinations, is that if it's going well, they start throwing you curveballs. But because you are so nervous and you have so much riding on these examinations, sometimes you get very disoriented and you really don't know whether the scenarios are getting more difficult because you're doing well or because you are in the process of failing. So, a few years ago, my dean told me a wonderful and unforgettable story. So he was at a meeting of some type, and a woman walked up to him, and he didn't recognize her. So he was about to introduce himself. And before he could even put his hand, she said to him, "I know exactly who you are." And he thought that didn't sound very good. So he said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Yes, yes, you were my Royal College examiner 20 years ago." And so he sort of paused and he said, "Well, how did things go? I assume you passed." And she said to him, "Oh, yes, yes, I passed all right." She said, "In fact, I did so well that the final question that you gave me was the following. You are the public officer of health on call in the city of Toronto, and you get a call on Christmas Day that two lions have escaped the zoo and managed to board the subway, and now they are getting off in 20 minutes at the Yonge and Eglinton subway line. Could you please tell us your approach to this problem?" And this woman, as she's talking to my dean, and this is a true story, she said, "You know what? Because of you, every time that I get on a subway for the last 20 years, I am looking around to see if I can see any lions." And there's an absurdity to this, but I actually love this story because I think of it as a pattern that manifests in many of our lives, and certainly in my own life. I get to a point that everything is going well and we are totally free and clear. And I don't even notice it because I'm still thinking to myself, what if this is the day with the lions? And you would be forgiven for asking what I could possibly know about lions. I grew up in a small town on the prairies, Brandon, Manitoba, about 100 miles outside of Winnipeg. 45,000 people. My dad taught electronics at a community college. And my mom was once briefly a producer at the CBC, although she eventually had to give that up to care for her children. And she stayed home with us because of a tragedy that happened in our lives. Now, Brandon was actually a very interesting place to grow up. It had a very rich artistic and musical community. And one of the very interesting things about growing up in a small and isolated place is that it can actually lead us to more introspection. And because I had grown up in the shadow of this tragedy that I mentioned, and in this small place, an artistic and isolated community, I think it was quite predictable that for me, the concept of art and suffering became very intimately intertwined. Later on, as you heard, I had the good fortune of coming to Western and studying for 2 degrees in English. But I always felt a little bit like the late, great writer Paul Kalanithi, who was a neurosurgeon and the author of the book When Breath Becomes Air. And when I read these words of Paul's, I just identified with them so strongly. And he wrote, I found myself, this is when he was also studying in the humanities, I found myself increasingly often arguing that direct experience with life and death questions were essential to being able to generate moral opinions about them. And so I think that sentiment actually encapsulates the reason that I ultimately went to medical school. Although, as I said, I still see medicine and literature as existing on a continuum. And in some ways, the literature that I studied as an undergraduate and a master's student actually gave me a very interesting framework for understanding suffering. And that was a really good thing because I was about to encounter a lot of it. So you can probably begin to guess how it was as a medical educator that I would come to lean on music and literature and the visual arts when it came to my approach to telling people how to become doctors. But this discovery of the relationship between arts and medicine actually is nothing new. Osler, who we often refer to as the father of modern medicine, is well known to have read an hour of classics before he went to bed every night. And it's only been in about the last 50 years that we had this shift towards the pure sciences being more prized than any aspect of humanities education as a prerequisite for medicine. But what's interesting is that recently the pendulum has begun to swing the other way. And in the last 25 years, there has been an increasing recognition that some education, often concurrently with medical studies in the humanities, actually makes people better doctors. Now, there might be more urgency to this question at this moment in time because medicine is facing a crisis, and it's one that existed before a global pandemic. And we are facing a burnout crisis. About 1/3 of practitioners in the last major Canadian survey self-described that they were suffering from burnout, and about 1/3 screened positive for symptoms of depression. Now, burnout in physicians and other healthcare providers, too, is a really complex problem. It has aspects of organizational and system function. It has cultural aspects, the historical culture of medicine. And it also has personal components, the personal qualities and factors that all of us bring with us to the table. But on some other level, medicine is also suffering from a crisis of meaning and purpose. And if we accept as our premise that art is one of the things that helps us to see and articulate the meaning and the purpose in our lives, then it is not actually a stretch to say that art may also help to deepen our connection to our meaning and purpose in the work that we do as physicians, but also the work that we do in the rest of our lives, whoever we are. So a few years ago, I visited a friend who is a physician at Columbia University. And Columbia has always been a leader in medical education when it comes to the relationship between the humanities and medicine. And they've done a lot of powerful work with narrative, but also with visual arts. And we call this concept teaching visual literacy. And the idea is that if you train healthcare providers to notice details in art, they may actually be more observant at the bedside when you take them to meet patients. And the literature does tell us that this actually bears out in real life. So this friend of mine, his name is Deepu Gowda. He was teaching a workshop at an inner city hospital for all their staff. And he invited me to come and join them to see his pedagogical method. So I met him at this clinic, and my friend Deepu put up a painting, a slide of a painting that I had never actually seen before. And now, if we were in a room together in the old drama workshop, I would be able to ask all of you to look at this painting with me and tell me what you see. But because we're not together, I'm going to tell you what it was like for me when I first saw it. When Deepu put up this picture for me, it was like all the oxygen went out of the room. Now, this painting, for those of you who haven't seen it before, is called Christina's World. Andrew Wyeth painted it in 1948, and it now hangs at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And poignantly for me, one of the last pre-pandemic things that I did that was meaningful, actually, I took my children to the MoMA and we saw this painting together for the first time. Now, when I look at this painting, instead of telling you what I see, I have an opportunity through some artwork that a friend created for me to show you. When I look at this painting, I see my sister. I see her on prairies in the same landscape where I grew up. And I see her looking off in the distance towards something that she will never find. Now, the woman in the original painting is named Christina Olsen. Christina probably had something called Charcot-Marie tooth disease. It's a misleading name. It doesn't involve any problem with your teeth. It's a disorder of the peripheral nerves that run all the way throughout our body and allow our muscles to have motor and our limbs to have sensory function. And Wyeth said that he painted this picture in order to do justice to what he called Christina's extraordinary conquest of a life, which he said most people would consider hopeless. Now, I don't know if Christina would consider her life to be a conquest, but what I do know is that my sister had a profound disability. And I know that her life was very, very hard. She had a brain tumor when she was 6 years old, and she had nightmarish postoperative complications. And that was the most important tragedy that happened in my family. And in many ways, her story became the central story of my life. And as an interesting offshoot, she had her life-saving surgery in London, Ontario. And in fact, when I came to Western for my scholarship interview, after that interview at the age of 17, I got on a city bus and went all the way to the southern part of the city to try to find the pediatric neurologist, who I believe is still a member of your community, George Hinton. And I went and somehow found the bravery to find him and ask if I could speak to him. And I was able to say hello to him and also to thank him for saving my sister's life. So you can see how this event shaped me, or perhaps you can begin to see it. And one of the reasons I put her into this picture is because I see her absolutely everywhere in pretty much everything that I do. And as French Cuban writer Annie Nin has said, the truth about us is that we don't see things the way they are. We see things the way that we are. So if you can stay with me, in about the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try to tell you some stories about medicine that I hope will help us to see an even bigger picture. And it's one that we are all part of as healthcare providers and also as humans, no matter what our occupation. And it's a picture that we have to be willing to show up in ourselves if we want to find meaning and purpose in our work and in our art. So I often say that growing up with a person with a disability was my real medical education. I saw how my sister was treated. Now, she had many wonderful experiences in London, Ontario, but she had many horrible experiences everywhere else. People often treated her and saw her as something less than human. And that unkindness and that lack of humanity left a profound stain and shadow on me and my family. This is a picture of my sister before she had her surgery. She was a perfectly neurologically normal child. And my sister probably had a genetic defect called Lynch syndrome. And I say probably because, again, in another literary twist, she literally died the night before she was going to have genetic testing at the lab the next day. But before her death, both my mother and my sister had been diagnosed with Lynch syndrome. And Lynch syndrome is a defect that predisposes people to cancer, and specifically colon, endometrial, and also brain, as well as others. And it's inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion, which means that if a parent has it, you have a 50% chance of getting that gene. And I am very lucky I did not inherit that gene myself. So my family's defective gene is called MSH6, and it's what's called a mismatch repair gene. It's a gene that encodes the proteins that are responsible for repairing mistakes during the replication of DNA. Now, DNA is always replicating because cells are always doubling. They're going from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 and so on. And each time they double, there's the possibility of making mistakes. Now, if a mismatch repair gene doesn't work, then you lack the proper cadre of proteins to repair the errors. And that means that one error can get through. And then that error can begin to double and go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 and so on. And that is all that it takes to develop a clinical cancer. And this is why one of my clinical axioms, Horton's axioms, is disasters happen slowly. Because by the time you can see a CT or the clinical manifestations very often of a cancer, it is very late in that cancer's life. And so that's how, by the age of 6 years old, my sister had a tumor in her head that was approximately the size of a small orange. Now, you might hear that and think to yourself, an orange? Well, didn't the people around her notice that? Weren't they paying attention? Actually, yes, they did notice that. My parents took her repeatedly to specialists. She was vomiting in the morning. She couldn't hop on one foot. And even Wendy's kindergarten teacher said, it's so funny. Wendy has this very big head. And you can even see it in her pictures if you just look. And in fact, the pediatric neurologist, Dr. Hinton, who made her diagnosis, took about 3 minutes to make it. He looked at her, he saw her, he paid attention, and he said to my parents, "Hasn't anyone ever looked into this girl's eyes before?" So, this is a question that I asked myself repeatedly growing up and after I became a doctor. Why was my sister's kindergarten teacher able to see something that a series of specialists missed? And it's probably one of the reasons that I became interested in this concept of visual literacy. There's actually another kind of literacy in medicine, and it's relevant too, and maybe it's even more important. And it's the literacy that allows us to understand and name our internal lives and our states. And we don't get any training in it to become physicians. It's the literacy that might make you notice that your gut is calling to tell you something important about the little 6-year-old girl in front of you whose head is just slightly big and doesn't look quite right. And it might be one of the most important skills in all of medicine. And we have actually left it entirely to chance. So I'm going to ask you to forget about medicine for a second. Because the stress that we deal with and the way that we struggle to manage our emotions in our day to day lives is actually already hard enough. We are hardwired with what's called a fight or flight response. And it's the same thing that makes us get agitated, increase our heart rate and our blood pressure when someone cuts in front of us in line at Starbucks or cuts us off when we're driving on the road. That surge of stress hormones, the readiness to encounter a threat. And that's just what happens during the small irritations of our day to day life. So imagine how that same fight or flight response is activated in proportion to things happening around you when everything happening around you is actually an emergency. And that does bring us back to medicine because there's no doubt that chronic occupational stress in medicine is contributing to our burnout crisis. And where do we start to address that? You can do it as a teacher, you can do it as a leader, as an administrator, but this is incredibly slow work. It isn't measured in days or weeks. And that's why I have shifted my focus to spending time thinking about the things that I actually can control. And the one thing that I can control is how I respond to stressful stimuli in my life. Rollo May, the great humanist psychologist in the tradition of Viktor Frankl, has a quote that we often talk about in mindfulness. And that quote is the idea, encapsulates the idea that our freedom as humans involves our choice of response between stimulus and response. There's a space in that gap. And we do get to choose which response we want to throw our weight behind because Rollo May tells us that is where we find our freedom. Now, like about 1/3 of Canadian doctors before the pandemic, I have also struggled to find that freedom. I've had times when I could barely be present with my children. I've experienced significant depersonalization, a sense of low accomplishment, and all the symptoms that are very classic for burnout. And actually, I hit a point in my life several years ago that when I knew that if I wanted to continue to be a physician, that something in my life had to change. And I ended up going to a retreat in Rochester, New York. And this is one of the central stories of my book. But I ended up going to this retreat for physicians who want to learn how to deal with the stresses of medicine differently, many of whom are experiencing burnout. And we go there at this retreat center in the woods to learn mindfulness. We think we're roughing it because the Wi-Fi is poor. But this center is run by physicians who have made a career out of learning to teach mindfulness to other healthcare practitioners. The program is evidence-based. It's published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the results have been repeated around the world. And the bottom line with this program is it does help. And I teach this program now because this program actually lifted me out of a big black hole that I was in. And it's an important point that I want to make because it is great and it is critically important to have art and literature and music as a strategy, as a template for dealing with suffering. But to be very, very clear, it can only take you so far. And after that, I think that you need some additional skills. So when I used to make these pilgrimages to Rochester before the pandemic, I used to fly to Toronto and travel from Toronto to Rochester in a very small plane that seated about 8 people. And I would literally always introduce myself to the other people on the flight because I had this terrible paranoia that we would be collaborating to make sure we could get out of an emergency exit somewhere over Lake Ontario. And on probably my second trip to Rochester, I was coming back and I started talking to one of the other passengers on the flight. And this man was a filmmaker. And I asked him, "What were you doing in Rochester?" And he told me he was screening a short film that he'd made at the Rochester Film Festival. And of course, I was fascinated by this. It was a throwback to my life in the arts. So I was grilling him about his film and what it was about. And I was just so interested. And then when there was a pause, he said to me, "So what were you doing in Rochester?" And I just kind of shrugged and I said to him, "Oh, I was just at this retreat in the woods where doctors go to talk about all their decades of repressed trauma and learn mindfulness to kind of cope with it. But can we go back and talk more about your film?" And this filmmaker, he was just like, "Hold on, pause. Stop for a second. Tell me more about this retreat." He was totally enthralled with this concept. And he actually said to me, "You know what? You and I need to collaborate and we have to make a film about this because the public wants to know that doctors are struggling in this way and feeling these things." You know what's really funny? Just as he was saying that to me, I happened to look up into the cockpit, which was still open. And I noticed that the pilot and co pilot were very young. They looked young enough to be in line at a Justin Bieber concert. And yet they also looked young enough to me that they reminded me of my students. And they looked to me like young people doing very high stakes jobs. And as I watched them go through their pre flight checklists, I turned to this filmmaker and I said, "You know what? You just helped me understand something. I don't think the public wants to know about this at all." And he said to me, he was about to argue, and I stopped him and I pointed at the cockpit and I said, "Do you actually want to know if those pilots are nervous?" And in that moment, for me, it was actually a very profound moment. Something suddenly clicked. Yes, we are in the middle, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic of a crisis of physician burnout, but people don't want to know about it. And it isn't because they don't care about physician suffering or healthcare workers suffering. It isn't that at all. They have the same attitude towards police or pilot suffering. It isn't that they don't care. I think that people don't want to know about that suffering because it is absolutely terrifying. Now, if you think about it, we depend on those pilots to land that plane, no matter how they're feeling. So it's actually much simpler for us to go on believing that those pilots feel nothing. But the question I want to ask you now is, who does that delusion actually help? This is one of the most iconic images of suffering in art. It's Vincent van Gogh. The painting is At Eternity's Gate. Now, I started by telling you that our Royal College examinations are really stressful, but we haven't even talked about training and its impact on individuals. Sleep deprivation, 100-hour work weeks, 28 or 32 hours or more of call with no sleep, medical error in a culture that does not typically allow us to talk about it, a culture that stigmatizes our suffering, especially when it translates into mental illness. And exhaustion that I think when I had my 3 children, my maternity leaves actually felt like upgrades. But in medicine, There is a particular crucible of suffering, and that suffering is the intensive care unit. It's a place where some of our most intense dramas play out with almost unbearable consistency. Now, a colleague shared a story with me a few years ago about her residency training. She was a resident on call in the intensive care unit, and she was looking after a woman who'd had a catastrophic event happen in her brain, a spontaneous intracerebral bleed. There was no intervention that was possible, and this woman was now brain dead. She was young, she was surrounded by her small children, by her spouse who was screaming and sobbing in his grief, by her parents, and all of them were in her room in the intensive care unit, literally facing the worst thing that any of us can ever imagine. So my colleague, she's a wonderful doctor. She walked out of the room and she went to the desk in the intensive care unit and she just stood there with her back turned for a few moments, overcome with her feelings and tears pouring down her face. And out of the corner of her eye, she saw a staff physician was walking towards her. And she saw that he has his arm crossed. And she saw that he was putting out his arm. And she thought for a minute, he's putting out his hand to put an arm on my shoulder. And instead, when she turned around, he looked at her. And do you know what he said? He said to her, "This is an emotion-free zone." And he walked away. Now, I want you to think about that cockpit and those pilots that we talked about. Do you think that cockpit is an emotion-free zone? I don't know about you, but I don't want a cockpit who thinks that the pilots in the cockpit think that it is an emotion-free zone. I don't want a pilot who starts freaking out every time there's a problem and screaming, "We're all going to die." But I do want a pilot who is emotionally intelligent, who can recognize and manage their fears as they arise, who can recognize the precursors to profound fear, who knows uncertainty, and who can name that gut feeling that something that's happening isn't quite right. And by the way, that's why we call them feelings, because we are supposed to be able to feel and localize them. This story makes me reflect on this question. And the question is, isn't fear valuable? And isn't grief valuable? Don't we actually believe that those emotions show up in our lives to tell us something? If you think of those statistics that I shared with you earlier, a third of doctors are burnt out, a third are experiencing depression, and Canadian data tells us that about 1 in 10 have experienced passive suicidal ideation in the last 12 months. What do you think happens when somebody says to you, "This is an emotion-free zone"? One part of the message is shame. You're disgusting. This is disgusting. And then there's also this message that this doesn't really concern you. You are not actually a part of this picture. But you see, that is a complete delusion because we are part of that picture, whether we want to be or not. And that, I think, is why there is a Zen retreat in the woods where people like me have to go to undo 20 years of repressed professional trauma. But doesn't that beg the question, what if there were another way? So this concept of showing emotions and emotion-free zones leads me quite naturally to another concept that is all over medical education. It is the idea of professionalism. Now, it's a word that has appeared in the medical education literature for about the last 25 years. And we talk about it as having some connection to the very root of what it means to us to be physicians. Now, it encapsulates some concepts like ethics and boundaries and our basic conduct. And at most medical schools, we lead courses on professionalism. And yet, one of the problems is that nobody can exactly agree on the meaning of that word in medicine. And in fact, I think it conjures up some images that bring the wrong concepts into play. And in fact, if I'm being honest, I actually hate that word. I think it is cold. It's a sterile word for a very fertile concept. And in my opinion, that word has actually misled an entire generation of physicians when it comes to what it actually means to be a doctor. I gave a lecture to third year medical students a few years ago. And it's a really lovely time to be interacting with them because they have just started on the ward and they're still new to the environment. They're the fish who haven't yet become blind to the water. And they have a lot of interesting observations to share. So one day in this lecture under the professionalism banner, I was asking them, do you guys notice the way we often round? That people will go into a room, they'll kind of swarm in like a flock of bees, and they'll barely interact with the patient. They'll just appear there as if it's going to be a shakedown. They'll barely acknowledge the patient's concerns or emotion. They impart important information as if they're sharing information off of a bus schedule. And I said, who in this room knows what I'm talking about when I describe this? And several of them put up their hands. And then I said, who has been in that situation, felt that it was wrong, wanted to do something about it, and couldn't, or felt that they couldn't? And several more hands went up. So then I asked the class, what do you think you as an individual can do as a small act of resistance? A need you see, something you can do to meet a need. What is something that you can do? I want you to think about it and come up with an answer to begin to resist the emotional brutality of this system. So they thought about it for a few minutes, and then a young woman put up her hand. And she said something that I just love. She was on her internal medicine rotation, and she said, Dr. Horton, I have a patient right now who has endocarditis, which is an infection of one of the heart valves. And often endocarditis is associated with our teeth being in poor shape for a number of reasons, not always. But she said, I was seeing this patient. I've been looking after him for a couple of weeks now. And when I went in to see him the other day, I started talking to him about his teeth. And I said, you should take better care of your teeth because you don't want to get endocarditis again. You should brush your teeth every day. And he said, well, I can't. And she was bewildered for a moment. She said, what do you mean you can't brush your teeth? He said, well, I don't have a toothbrush. And she said, well, you should get one. He said, well, I don't have the money for one. And the hospital doesn't provide toothbrushes anymore. So she was rightly taken aback by this. And she said to me, so Dr. Horton, I'm thinking that tomorrow I am going to bring him a toothbrush. And, it is so small. It is such a small gesture. But I loved that story personally. I thought, here's a learner seeing a patient, seeing their need, a need that they can't meet, and honoring it with a simple gesture that barely costs anything. To me, it was human and tangible, and it was saying to that man, I see you. But I also noticed a really funny energy in the room. And remember, I said, like a pilot, you have to be able to pick up what's happening before it can evolve into something bigger. And I actually had a feeling that something in the room was going unsaid, but the problem was I didn't know what it was. So I went home after that lecture and I thought about it. And for some reason that night, it just hit me like a bolt of lightning. I realized that there were people in that room who thought that buying a patient a toothbrush was unprofessional because they thought it was a gift. They thought it was crossing a professional boundary. And I want you to remember, I'm talking about a 99-cent toothbrush, not a diamond necklace, not a new laptop, a toothbrush. So I had that hunch and I emailed a senior representative in the class that I trust. And I said, can you survey your peers and tell me if my hunch is right? And he did a quick little survey and he got back to me. And what he shared with me was that at least 40% of the class were uncertain as to whether or not they could buy a patient, a man who had no home, no family, no money, no anything, a 99-cent toothbrush. And let me tell you that when I hit this realization, it depressed and deflated me. And I began putting together material for a follow up lecture so I could help them explore and understand the nuance of this topic. And while I was doing that, I came across an article that I hadn't seen before. And that article was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it was by an American physician. And it was the story of how he had had a patient who desperately needed a simple course of medication. And he'd been on the phone with American insurers for 2 hours, calling each of them, pleading for coverage for this simple medication for his patient. And finally, with his patient despondent in front of him at the end of that 2 hour period, he hung up the phone, he took out his wallet, he opened it, and he handed them $30. It wasn't a loan. There was no fanfare. There was no extortion. He just didn't know how else to help the person in front of him. So, by the way, that doctor's name was Gordon Schiff. And he wrote in JAMA that while he did not expect to be commended or celebrated for that simple act of kindness, he also did not expect to have to deal with the trauma and sense of personal and professional violation at being reprimanded for his unprofessional and boundary crossing behavior after the resident that he was supervising reported him to their clinic director. Now, a few years ago, I read a different story in the New York Times. It was about an elderly couple in Italy who were shut ins. And a neighbor heard them crying, knocked on the door. There was no answer, didn't know what to do, so they called 911. And the paramedics came and they got into the apartment and they examined this elderly couple and found that there was nothing physically wrong with them, but they were both crying. And the paramedics said to them, "Why are you crying?" And they answered that they had been watching television and they'd seen a show about children suffering somewhere else in the world. And it had made them so sad that both of them were weeping uncontrollably. Now, do you know what happened next? Do you think the paramedics turned to that couple and said, "Sorry, this is an emotion free zone," and drove away? Well, this story happened in Italy. And what the paramedics did is they went into that couple's kitchen and they made them a simple dinner of pasta and sauce. And they served them, perhaps in the truest sense of the word. They saw a human need and they went on to meet it. And when I first read that story, I think that I thought the best part about it was just the unfiltered kindness. But now, actually, my favorite part is that nobody hauled those paramedics in front of a regulatory board or accused them of boundary crossing behavior or inappropriate food handling without a license or said that they had crossed a critical professional boundary. And it's interesting because paramedics are another group of people with a very difficult job. In fact, I read a study a few years ago that put their self reported suicide attempt rate at almost 10%. And for doctors, we are believed to have the highest completed suicide rate of all the white collar professions. The risk is 40% greater for men, and it's almost double the population's baseline risk in female physicians. Now, these kinds of suicide rates, they don't sound like they reflect emotion-free zones. To me, they sound like they reflect working in zones where there is deep suffering. And actually, I have a confession. My confession is that considering what happened to my family and some of our early traumatic experiences with physicians, I actually never thought that I would find a deep well of compassion for doctors. And in fact, I became a physician, as I shared with you, to be unlike all those other doctors, the ones who had been so unkind to my family. But you know what I discovered during my 100-hour work weeks and emotion-free zones and young people dying in front of me and more grief than I knew how to metabolize? I discovered that I am exactly like those other doctors, except for one key difference. And that difference is that I know what it's like when it's your loved one in that bed or that wheelchair, and you need a real live person to just show up and care for you and be with you in that picture. And I know that the abandonment of when people didn't show up and do that for my family and me was actually the worst trauma. Because when you act like you work and operate in an emotion free zone, you cannot blame people for assuming that the reason you're not showing emotion is that you don't give a damn. And you know, there is another problem with that behavior. There's no joy, there's no positive emotion, no celebration. We've narrowed our emotional range. And maybe this is another trauma that we as physicians have inflicted on ourselves as a profession. Maybe we don't really feel anything. I don't know if you remember Captain Sullenberger. He was the 2009 hero pilot who landed a plane on the Hudson River in New York City. Birds hit the engines bilaterally and they failed. And he did this miracle landing, and absolutely everybody on board walked off alive. And I remember in the weeks after that miraculous event reading something that really struck me. It was in an interview with Captain Sullenberger, and he said that months later he would still wake up and be tortured by a single question. And that question was, how could I have landed the plane better? Now, I know you probably say to yourself, how in the world can anybody feel that way after doing what he did? But I want to tell you something. Every doctor who hears this story nods their head so hard that they practically give themselves a concussion. Doctors really understand this concept. And I had my own Sullenberger moment actually in around 2018. It didn't happen in the hospital. I was on my way to work and I was late for work because my kids had been having some stupid fight and they made me 10 minutes late. So I dropped them off 10 minutes late and I was cranky as I carried on. But because I was 10 minutes late, I happened to be passing through an intersection at the exact moment that a pedestrian collapsed and fell to the ground. And I just instinctively parked and got out of my car and I ran over. And just like Captain Sullenberger, although my situation was infinitely, infinitely, infinitely simpler, I did exactly what I've spent the last 20 years training to do. The only difference was I did it in unusual circumstances, minus 20 on a Winnipeg street, wearing a parka. I ran a code blue. And after what felt like an eternity of giving CPR with another bystander, the paramedics arrived and they took over. And I carried on to work. And I actually phoned the emergency department. I knew which hospital he was going to. And I called one of my colleagues and gave him a bit of collateral history, what I'd heard about the collapse. And then this man was actually admitted to my hospital, just a couple of doors down from where my office is. And the story got a bit of momentum among my peers because it was a feel-good story. This man made a perfect neurologic recovery, and we've since become friends as families. But the interesting thing, my friends kept saying to me, you know, you must feel absolutely amazing. And on one level, yes, I did, because it is an indescribable privilege to save another person's life. But at the same time, what I actually felt was much more complicated. I kept thinking that I should have landed the plane better. I should have checked for a medic alert bracelet. I should have had a portable mask with me. I usually do carry one, but I didn't that day. And I thought that I should have sent someone to the nearby synagogue to check if they had a defibrillator. So again, I know some of you hear that and think this is totally absurd. That man is alive today because I was lucky enough to be going through that intersection at that time. But you know what? I know that every doctor who hears this story understands it. And you know what? I think it actually comes back to my story about the lions. We're always waiting for an even bigger disaster in medicine because you see, that is exactly what they trained us to do. We just didn't know that it would creep into every single aspect of our lives, that it would ultimately poison us a little bit. And that might be why one of the very best things I have ever done for myself in my life was get on that plane and go to Rochester, because it was a turning point in my life. And it was where I actually started tapping my own phone and listening to the internal calls. And a lot of them went something like this: you should have checked for a bracelet. You should have gone for a defibrillator. You're an imposter. You're not passing. You're failing. And when you make a mistake, everyone is going to know the truth about you. Well, what is the truth about me anyway? That I'm a human being with emotions, with strengths and weaknesses like everybody else, with moments of brilliance and moments of total stupidity, just like everybody else. But you see, I still wonder if people want to know that about me because they need me to land that plane. But I have also learned that people can surprise us. And that's why I have one final story I want to share with you today. So that story is about a patient, and it's about a patient with cancer, an absolutely lovely man. His diagnosis started with 1 cell, then 2 cell, then 4 cells, then 8 cells, and so on. 2 million, 4 million, disaster happening slowly. And I admitted him one day in very poor medical condition. One of his medications had made him very ill, and he had a critically high calcium level as well. And I spent the day trying to treat him with fluids, going in and out of his room, using other medications, seeing if he was responding. But after about 8 hours, it was pretty clear to me that this situation was not going to end well, and this man was dying. So at the end of the day, his family arrived, and I had no idea how much they knew or understood. And I went into the room and I sat down and I pulled up a chair and I leaned in. And I could feel in my body the deep grief and sadness that was present in that room. And I told this lovely man and his family that probably today or tomorrow would be the last day of his life. Now, it is 1 to 2 million times harder for patients being on that side of the conversation, but I can tell you that most physicians still find that conversation personally hard. Sometimes it reminds us of our own grief and our own losses. And I think some doctors actually find it so hard that they don't even have that conversation at all, which is another clue that we are failing somewhere along the way, because that kind of abandonment is not fair to anybody. So while we were having this very tough conversation, I noticed that there was one family member in the corner standing a bit of a distance away from me. And he had his arms crossed, just like this. And I told you that I practice visual and emotional literacy, and I get really used to reading people. I get used to guessing what they do for a living, where they're from, what they might be most afraid of, what is unspoken in a room. But I couldn't read this gentleman. I didn't know if he was angry or just holding in his emotions. I had absolutely no idea who he was or what he was bringing into the room. But after I finished this meeting, I gave my condolences to the family and I promised to keep their loved one comfortable. And I stepped out of the room. And I have to tell you, my ward and my patient encounters are not emotion-free zones. And I had tears in my eyes as I stood at the sink washing my hands. And that's when I noticed that this man who'd had his arms crossed had followed me out of the room. And he was just standing there, still crossing his arms, and he was looking straight at me. And I turned and looked at him, and I was actually a little bit afraid. I had absolutely no idea why he'd followed me out or what he wanted to say. And then he said to me very quietly, "I don't know how you do what you do." I said to him what I always say when someone says something like that. I say, you know what? I've been on the other side of these conversations, and it's infinitely harder. And he looked at me again and he was shaking his head and he said, "Are you so sure about that?" Now, this was a really unusual comment. And I said to him, "I am really curious about you. I'm curious why you were thinking that. And I wonder what you do for a living." And he said to me, "I want you to guess." And, I looked at him and actually I had no idea. At first, I thought maybe he was in healthcare. And then I thought, well, maybe he was a teacher. And then I thought maybe he was a spy, although I realized he probably wouldn't tell me that if I asked him. So after entertaining these possibilities, I said to him, "I have no idea what you do. I give up." And then he did this. He made the sign of a pistol because he was a police officer. And I have to tell you, my jaw just dropped. I could not believe this. This man is a police officer. Police officers get shot at. They work in parts of town that I'm afraid to drive through because of personal safety. They manage scenes after accidents that are scarier than anything that I am capable of watching on Netflix. And here's a police officer shaking his head in awe and saying to me, "I don't know how you do what you do." Well, do you know what that police officer did for me in that moment? He gave me a gift. And he gave me a gift because he brought me into a picture. And you know what? It's a picture that sometimes even I write myself out of. I say, it's harder for you. It's harder for my patients. It's harder for my parents. It's harder for my sister. It's harder for absolutely everyone around me. It's harder, harder, harder. And it is hard for all those people. It is so hard. But you know what? It is also really hard to be right there in the middle of the action if you are really showing up as yourself. And I want to show you one last thing because I think that this is really quite amazing. Now, Van Gogh, near the end of his life, he was deep in a spiral of depression. And he painted in those 6 weeks a series of very affecting paintings. And that 6 week period would culminate in a completed suicide for him. And this was around the time that he painted the first painting I showed you at Eternity's Gate. And he also painted a portrait of his doctor. And this is his doctor, Dr. Gachet. And actually, Van Gogh wrote at one point to his brother, and he said of Dr. Gachet, my doctor tries to help me, but the truth is that he is almost as screwed up as I am. And looking at this relationship between the two of them, I started reading. And I actually discovered that many patients had painted this Dr. Gachet. And here are some of these images. Here's one. Here's another. This is one. And here's one more. And what I can't help but notice about each of these paintings is patients are seeing Dr. Gachet different things for each of them. Kindness, these large, paternal, caring hands in one picture, an expression of compassion or wisdom. And maybe each one of his patients was actually seeing him as they wanted him to be. But the interesting thing is that when we put these all together, they form something quite multidimensional. And by looking at each of them, we're allowed to see a fully dimensional human being. And that's who we are too. And you see, that is actually how I was eventually able to answer that police officer, the one who said that he doesn't know how I do what I do. I realized that after 20 years, the answer is that I have learned to allow myself to be present as myself. Just the way we can't live without oxygen and water, we also can't live in an emotion-free zone. Now, I know what some people will say. Some physicians and some learners will say, well, that's not sustainable. And I'm here to tell you that it is sustainable. You are correct if you say that doctors who are very empathetic are more at risk of burnout, but people say the same thing about Lynch syndrome. They say having Lynch syndrome means that you'll get cancer. And you know what? No, it doesn't. It means that you're more likely to get cancer. And with good care and attention to risk and lifestyle and preemptive measures, it is possible for you to end up healthier and happier than anybody. And the reason for that is that risk is not destiny. So, what I want to leave you with this afternoon is this: art requires that we put ourselves into it. That is to understand it, to animate it, and to make it relevant to life. We are the ones who complete its meaning. And the art of medicine is exactly the same. The idea that you have to give up the best parts of yourself in order to become a doctor or any kind of healthcare professional, that you can't cry in the ICU or tell your patients about your beloved late sister or buy somebody a toothbrush, those are not the things that put us in harm's way in medicine. The opposite is true. Learning how to understand and honor our instincts and our emotions is exactly how we make a zone where there is real freedom. And that is the only way that we can learn to see what is really in a picture. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. It has been a privilege, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jillian, for being with us today and for such an inspiring talk. We are privileged today to have this as a multidisciplinary rounds and to have had so many people log on. At one point, we had over 300 participants from Schulich and from our distributed sites and from all over Ontario. So I really just want to thank you for your talk. And there's lots of people that are putting questions into our question and answer screen right now. And when you put your questions in, we have a hour to have a discussion with Jillian, and then just asking that you can possibly put where you're from, because I think that will be interesting for everyone here today. Today is Western Day, and so Jillian, the first question that I want to ask you is if you could speak of a meaningful experience that you had as a student here at Western.
Well, just before we started the talk at the top of the hour, I was sharing with you a little known story, one that I don't think is known outside of the circle of my life. So I was privileged to get the care and guidance and mentorship of Richard and Beryl Ivy. When I was an undergraduate student, I was lucky enough to hold the scholarship that bears the name of Dick's parents. And they would, they showed some interest and kindness towards me throughout my entire undergraduate degree. But as I approached this point where I was uncertain whether I was going to branch off and go to medical school or go to Oxford, where I had been lucky enough to get a Commonwealth scholarship to do my PhD, one day Beryl and Dick invited me out for lunch. And when we got there, after we ate, the conversation quickly turned to something that they had on their minds. And Beryl said that they had been discussing it and they were concerned that the playing field was so uneven for me between medical school, which would probably require about $50,000 worth of debt, versus Oxford, which was an entirely paid for experience. And so Beryl said to me, Dick and I have decided that we would like to level the playing field. And at that moment, they wrote me checks to cover all the costs of my first year of medical school. And it wasn't a loan, it was just a gift. And I do remember Dick saying that his only wish is that this was compassion and a kind of activism that I would continue to pay forward in my own life. So I'm not sure without that little push that I would have gone, because I was also sharing with you, when you grow up in a family where there has been devastating illness, you always feel some trepidation about the certainty of the future. So for me, borrowing money had a lot of other significance rather. And this, I think, is what pushed me onto the path towards medicine. It was such an incredible act of generosity, and typical of them. People always associate their names, obviously, with certain ventures in the business school and other things at Western, but they did a lot of incredible things for people behind the scenes that only the lucky recipients know about. So that was definitely one of the infinite ways in which my time at Western profoundly shaped the life that I have today.
Thank you for sharing that, Jillian. That's a really lovely story. There's another question in the chat that's quite well thought out from Maggie. She said, I do not work in the medical profession, but I found your stories and experiences in your book so relatable. You describe residency as being in jail. My question is, what would you say to your three sons if they were thinking of pursuing medicine?
Oh, Maggie, sorry. Yeah.
What do you think can be done differently by either the universities or the hospitals to change the experience for upcoming students and doctors?
Maggie, that is such a great question, because there's actually a lot of data around this idea of when doctors are asked the question, would you like your children to go into medicine? What would you say? Would you encourage or discourage them? And depending on the source you look at, a really sizable portion of physicians say they would actually actively discourage their children from pursuing the profession, which is so sad. So if my children were ever to have any inclination in that direction, I think the most important thing for me would be to understand why, what they were driven by, that meaning and purpose. What did they really believe at the heart of their decision was the most important thing? And based on that, I would probably counsel them accordingly, because I think medicine should be something that you go into because you feel that you must. And I don't think that's the only path, but it's very helpful, because frankly, I think if I hadn't had that connection, that sense that I had to do this, there are times when it has been so difficult that I might well have walked away. I had other things I could do, like so many physicians. And in fact, there are a couple of very popular books about medicine that are out right now, one that's coming out. And, the end of the story, that people leave medicine. And I wanted to paint a different path and highlight that I don't believe that that is the inevitable result of the situation that we're in. So you asked another question about what hospitals have to do and what medical education institutions have to do. And some of those things we are beginning to do. The culture of medicine really has to change to one where, first of all, we accept that we are human, that we have physiologic limitations, that after a certain number of consecutive work hours, that our performance is impaired in the same way that it is if we were to show up to work at that same point intoxicated. And we have to accept that our culture has made a wrong turn somewhere in terms of its values and its premises in terms of what we are actually capable of. And then the second thing also involves large scale change with licensing bodies and institutions, how we see signs of weakness, or what we traditionally have treated as signs of weakness, rather. I don't see them that way. But how we treat people when they self declare that they are in that third of physicians that are screening positive for depression, or when they want to take an academic leave or a personal leave just to recover from what's been happening. We don't tend to look at those things favorably. Our licensing bodies have had a lot of problems in terms of how they handle those things, and change has to occur at that level. And the one hopeful note I would say is more and more we're seeing an improvement in the quality of our leadership. And I don't mean that our previous leaders haven't been good or capable, but we know, and the literature on physician burnout really tells us, that one of the most important things for any organization is the quality of leadership, whether that leadership is humble, whether that leadership is pro-social, emotionally intelligent, values people, allows their humanity to be present, supports their challenges, the ones that we all have in life. And I'm seeing, even our new CMA, Canadian Medical Association president-elect, Alika LaFontaine, who you might have seen him interviewed a little bit in the last couple of days. And he is incredible. He's exactly the kind of person you want shaping the dialogue about the culture that we create and where we go next. And it touches on all these other things that have been major historical problems in medicine: racism, sexism, hierarchical culture, and sort of abuse and mistreatment being quite normalized. So that's a long answer, but I think those are the places that we start as this dialogue unfolds.
That's excellent. Thank you, Jillian. The next question in our chat is from Alicia. And Alicia says, your discussions of power are really interesting, such as the line in your book, people with power have a duty to speak with care because they have been entrusted with something fragile they have no right to break. It seems that your sister, a helpless girl, gave you so much agency and power. How would you describe your experience with gendered power in medicine?
That's another great question. So, medicine, again, this is one of the fronts where we have a lot of work to do. We look at, first of all, the highest levels of leadership, deans at Canadian medical schools. I mean, women, I may have the number wrong, but, maybe 10%. If we look all over North America, I think the numbers are 10 to 15%. So women at those high levels of leadership are very rare. And I think, frankly, within our immediate clinical environments, many environments are much further ahead than others. And we go back to that old adage, it's hard to be what you can't see. So I had some fabulous, powerful female mentors, including Sharon Strauss, who is the physician in chief at Unity Health now, who has been sort of like Stan Draglin, part of my life for 20 years, and a counsel and confidant and a huge support. So, those people can help us navigate some of the challenges, but gender is a huge issue in medicine. And again, I think there is still a lot of resistance and still a lot of blindness to what the problem actually is. I have a lot of male colleagues who really get it, who really understand that the experiences of the women that they work alongside with are often fundamentally different than theirs. And that's why they really can't see the problem, because they've never had to walk in those shoes and live with it. It is a lot, of course, like systemic racism in medicine. But at the same time, we do still have, anytime you see someone write an article about gender in medicine, there's largely a positive response. And then there's a small segment of the old guard who write in, this is a non-problem, this is whining, this is stupid, and sort of exemplify exactly why the dialogue has to be happening. So I guess, how have I weathered it personally? The single best thing I think we can do is band together with male allies. We have many of them, especially men who have daughters. They really see this issue in a totally different way once they are looking at the opportunities that are available to their daughters versus their sons. And then I think just really cultivating our relationships with other women. And when we raise issues, when we try to change our environment, doing that in a group, because it's hard work, it's exhausting work. And if you allow yourself to sort of be walled off as one person raising these issues or doing these things, you are more vulnerable. So just to validate a huge problem, an ongoing problem, there's more awareness of it, I think, every year, but I don't know how much change we're going to make between now and the end of my career, because it's just like culture change. It is slow, slow work.
Thank you, Jillian. That's such a meaningful answer to that question. The next question comes from Damon Dagnoni from Queen's University in Kingston. He said, thank you for sharing your stories with us. I really enjoyed your last few minutes of the talk and saying that you have allowed yourself to be yourself with patients, trusting your own instincts and emotions. My own life experiences have made me feel similarly in my EM practice. My question is, how do you think we can have the greatest effect at a systems level with respect to the themes that you discussed?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Damon. The first thing is, I think as institutions, we have to celebrate people who practice in this way. And we haven't traditionally done that. It doesn't mean that we haven't said, oh, so-and-so is so kind or such a compassionate physician. But if you think of it, what we traditionally, the artifacts that we espouse in our cultures, they're related to academic achievement. They're the top researcher, the top producer, and even clinical teaching. Historically, has it had that kind of deep bedside presence quality that we've been valued, that is what we value in a ward? I'm not sure that that's a constant. It's certainly the case sometimes, but it is not consistently the case. So number one, I think institutions have to make a commitment to really celebrating in a high profile way the people who practice this way. Because I think, Damon, the other thing, and I know some of your work, and you'll probably agree with me on this, too often we have treated compassion and sophisticated communication as optional add-ons in medicine. We have this dialogue that's like, my surgeon, yeah, he doesn't communicate with me very well. Sorry to pick on surgeons because this happens across the board. So just using that as an example, he doesn't communicate that well, but I don't need my surgeon to be my friend. I need him to save my life. My question is, again, where did this false dichotomy come from? Who said anything about him being your friend and going golfing for you? That should not preclude your physician engaging with you in a way that is deeply and profoundly human. And if they're not doing that, I would argue that somewhere along the way, they have gotten a free pass when it comes to one of the most fundamental skills. Because if your physician cannot talk to you in a way that makes you comfortable, that reflects an understanding of who you are, your ability to reflect back to them what they just told you, and some of the things in the room that may be influencing your decisions in a compassionate and holistic way, they are not going to be able to give you the care that you need. They're not going to understand why you're declining surgery or why you want surgery when they don't recommend it. And they're not going to be able to navigate those things. So this is not just some add-on, some bonus characteristic that you get as an added detail in a great physician. This is a core competency and a fundamental aspect of what it is. And so that, and I know that, and many of our colleagues know that. But until our institutions begin to celebrate people who are clinically excellent and also practice in that same way, and establish as a premise that the absence of those skills is not acceptable, then we'll begin to see culture change. So I think it has to happen top down, as well as that floating upward effect that I think all of us have when we model a way to be deeply human in clinical practice. I think that's how we're going to finally begin to see change. But again, a slow process.
Thank you, Jillian, and thank you, Damon, for that question. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. It says, incredible and inspiring talk. My question is about health professions who work in spaces like psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. They work with emotion, yet we treat them as second class within medicine. We do not value and honor their emotional expertise. We seek to reduce stigma against help seeking, yet we continue to stigmatize those who work in mental health. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, what a great question. And I would echo the sentiment that this individual expresses, that we really have a tradition. So for example, if you are a student going through your medical school program and you're approaching the residency match time, and someone says to you, "What are you going to do?" And you say psychiatry. Probably every resident I know who has ended up choosing psychiatry has had someone along the way say something incredibly foolish. And that comment is, "Oh, you're too smart to do psychiatry." So we do have within medicine this disparagement that happens. And we hear the same thing with family medicine, by the way. It can also be undervalued. And so, how do we begin to change that? Well, I would like to believe that on one level, if we can, over the course of the next decade, begin to make a cultural shift in medicine towards physicians being able to reflect their own difficulties, have more public conversations about their own difficulties, I think for our learners and our staff, it does help begin to humanize those who are suffering from those same problems. I think it's really powerful to hear when physicians speak out about having had their own mental health struggles or challenges, whether it was during the course of their training or at other times. But I also think if we can shift towards a more patient-centric approach, a more emotionally intelligent way of practicing and of training our physicians, I would like to believe simply that a byproduct of that will be an increase in our understanding and evaluation of the role that our mental health professionals provide. Because if you think about it, mental health professionals, one of the main things that I see them as trading in is suffering and validating other people's experiences and suffering and walking with people through suffering. And I'd like to think that if we could begin to boost that capacity in our learners, in our colleagues, in our future doctors, that they would not be so vulnerable to writing off that portion of their colleagues or undervaluing their colleagues' skills in that regard, because they would have perhaps more emotional literacy of their own. But a very real problem, I agree with you, and we have a lot of work to do on that front as well.
Thank you, Jillian, for that answer. That's very thoughtful. The next question is interesting from Boyana Radan. And she says, thank you so much for your talk. It was powerful. Do you have any tips for students or new residents when we enter into spaces where we feel like we can't create or express the level of empathy or emotion we want, or it's frowned upon when there's such a strong power dynamic in training?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. And I'll tell you, I think, as you can probably imagine from hearing me talk, that as a medical student, patients were everything to me. And I can tell you that I cannot think of an environment where the way that I interacted with patients or engaged with patients was influenced by the kind of power dynamic that you describe. Now, maybe that's easier for me, right? Because in a way, I came to medicine. I never had a sort of light bulb moment where I suddenly realized that this kind of behavior is harmful. I always saw it as a 10 out of 10 offense to not smile at people, to not engage with them in nonverbal ways. And so I would like to believe, and I do indeed believe, that when we walk into a room, patients can feel our presence. You can see, just like if you walk into a room with me and I barely make eye contact and I don't really look at you, and even if you add 5 more people, if those other 5 people are not looking at you, not making eye contact, but there's one person whose eyes are on you, who's smiling, who's making gestures that suggest that confirm that they are listening, that they are fully present, never accept the idea that that doesn't matter. It does matter. And also never accept the idea that that behavior can be contagious. So you can't control, you're right, if there's a senior physician in the room, and I'm not talking about them being abusive or things that you would consider reporting, but if they're just not warm, they're cold, they're not the way that we would even want to be treated at Starbucks, let alone if we were a patient in a room, but they're just kind of acting like that. I unequivocally believe, and this is what I teach and what I practice, that just one person in that room radiating something different, engaged, present, interacting, making making a little joke, saying hello. It doesn't have to be something that anyone is going to say took extra time or that they will necessarily call out as being radically different. It's just another way of being. And then what happens, very quickly, the amazing thing about medicine is it's sort of a life cycle on steroids, right? So your M3 year feels like it lasts forever, but in fact, before you know it, you're going to be an R1. And then when you're an R1, you're going to be supporting those Med 4s and Med 3s, and they will be looking up to you. They will be watching whether they know it or not. How do you treat people? Oh, look, she's nodding. She's interacting in a warm way. She made a little joke. I can do that too. She knows the name of this patient's kids, of her pet at home. And this is another powerful way that we change the culture, one person at a time. And this is why I like us to think about what is within my locus of control. Because I have this dilemma too, right? I have been an associate dean. I'm an associate head of my department, but I can't change what my colleagues do. And let me tell you, sometimes I don't like it at all. But what I can control is how I treat people in every single interaction, the nurses, the ward clerks, the patients, the personal support workers, every single person in the hospital. And do I believe that that matters? Yes, I definitely do. So I think that's where it starts. And that's the best positive and proactive framing that any of us can have as we look at this truly wicked problem.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn this over to Andrea now.
Thank you so much, Jillian. And what an inspiring message to deliver at the end of this very thoughtful hour and a half. I can't believe how many physicians signed on. I've been taking notes on behalf of Western University, President Ellen Shepard, and he also signed on, as well as Dean Michael Mildy and Dean John Yu. We really thank you for coming today to provide us with all these insights. I too feel very profoundly that it does take both the structure at the university, the hospital, and every single one of us. We can do it, but we need to do this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It really was an absolute privilege and very profoundly important to me to be able to be here with all of you today. I'm so grateful to Western and all of the work that you are all doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.